There's something quietly undeniable about Felix of Stray Kids that keeps showing up in the most unexpected places, not on a K-pop stage, but in Hollywood green rooms, late-night TV sets, and the social feeds of some of America's biggest names. We're not talking about a passing celebrity interaction or a staged fan moment. We're talking about a pattern where some of the most recognized figures in American entertainment, actors, musicians, fashion icons, seem to notice the same thing, that Felix carries himself differently from the other 7 members around him. The question is, what exactly is it? Is it the voice that doesn't match the face? The calm that doesn't break even under pressure? Or something harder to define, that rare quality where a person doesn't need to announce themselves to be remembered? 7 American legends, from action stars to Grammy-level producers, have each had their own brush with that question. And when you look at these moments closely, not through the lens of fan enthusiasm, but through cold observation, a clearer picture starts to form. Number 7. Ryan Reynolds. Felix has an aura that commands attention instantly. Most people don't expect a Hollywood A-lister to publicly express admiration for a K-pop group, but Ryan Reynolds isn't most people, and Stray Kids isn't most groups. In 2024, as the promotional machine for Deadpool and Wolverine began accelerating, Stray Kids became part of one of the most talked about marketing moments of the year. The group filmed a promotional video styled around the Deadpool universe, a concept that was sharp, self-aware, and visually precise. Ryan Reynolds, who has built an entire career on knowing exactly what works in media and what doesn't, acknowledged the collaboration. For a man who treats every public interaction as a calculated creative move, that kind of acknowledgement doesn't happen by accident. But here's where it gets interesting, and where Felix specifically enters the conversation. Within that Deadpool-themed content, Felix stood out in a way that was hard to ignore. And this wasn't simply a matter of screen time or positioning, it was something more immediate than that. Even within a group of 8 visually striking performers, Felix created a distinct visual anchor. The moment your eye finds him, it tends to stay there. To understand why, you have to understand what Ryan Reynolds himself has mastered over the course of his career, the concept of presence. Reynolds built his brand not just on good looks or comedic timing, but on a very specific ability to hold a frame without demanding it. He doesn't overperform. He doesn't force charisma. He simply occupies space in a way that feels inevitable. When he looked at Deadpool-era content featuring Stray Kids, it's reasonable to believe that what registered wasn't just the group's energy as a whole, but the individual members who carried that same quality. Felix, among all 8 members, demonstrates this most visibly. Consider what makes Felix immediately recognizable in any group setting. First, there's his physical contrast within the lineup. Stray Kids as a group presents a range of styles and aesthetics, but Felix's combination, the freckles that have become something of a signature, the softer facial structure, the blonde or platinum hair he's worn in several eras, gives him a visual profile that reads differently from his members. He doesn't look like a supporting character in someone else's story. He looks like the lead of his own. Second, and this is the part that consistently surprises first-time viewers, his voice. When Felix speaks or raps, the sound that comes out is so dramatically disconnected from the face producing it that it creates what psychologists might call a cognitive interrupt, a moment where your brain has to recalibrate. His voice is genuinely deep. Not performed deep, not stylistically low, but naturally, distinctly bass-toned in a way that is rare even among adult male vocalists, let alone in an industry where higher vocal ranges are more common. When that voice hits for the first time alongside his appearance, people stop. They rewind, they screenshot, they share. This is the kind of contrast that doesn't need marketing. It markets itself. Ryan Reynolds understands marketing at a cellular level. His work with Aviation Gin, his ownership and rebranding of Wrexham AFC, his entire social media persona. All of it is built on the principle that the most effective content is the kind that feels effortless, but is actually extremely precise. When he engaged with Stray Kids in the context of Deadpool promotion, the group's ability to generate organic attention was clearly a factor, and Felix, arguably more than any other member, is the one who generates that organic second look. There's also something worth noting about the way Felix carries himself in cross-cultural, high-pressure moments. The Deadpool collaboration wasn't a simple social post. It was a full creative intersection between one of the biggest Hollywood franchises in recent years and one of the most globally recognized K-pop groups. For members of Stray Kids, navigating that kind of cultural crossover requires a certain amount of composure. Felix, who was born in Australia, trained under JYP Entertainment, and has spent years performing for audiences across radically different cultures, handles these transitions with a naturalness that isn't common. He doesn't shift registers depending on who's watching. He's the same person whether the camera is Korean, Australian, or Hollywood. That consistency is rarer than it sounds. In the context of Ryan Reynolds, a performer and businessman who has built his identity on exactly that kind of consistent, unrehearsed authenticity, Felix reads as someone who operates by a similar internal logic. The difference, of course, is that Reynolds has 2 decades of experience calibrating that persona, while Felix is doing it at a fraction of that age, in a second language, across multiple continents simultaneously. When you put those factors together, the visual contrast, the unexpected voice, the cultural fluency, the unforced presence, it becomes clearer why Felix tends to be the member that outsiders to K-pop notice when encountering Stray Kids through something like a Deadpool crossover. He doesn't require context to register. You don't need to know his name or his role in the group or his backstory to feel that something about him is different. Ryan Reynolds built a career on being that person in the room, and when the Deadpool promotional content landed, Felix was quietly demonstrating that he might be building the same kind of thing, entirely on his own terms. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And the next person on this list noticed something even more specific about Felix. Not his visual presence or his voice, but the quality of his personality that becomes impossible to ignore the moment he steps in front of a live audience. Number 6. Jimmy Fallon. Felix has a character that's impossible to overlook. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon is one of the most competitive stages in American entertainment, not because of the production budget or the celebrity guest list, but because of what it demands from every performer who walks through its doors. You have minutes, sometimes seconds, to make an impression on an audience that has seen everything. Late-night television has a way of revealing exactly who a performer really is when the scaffolding of a controlled stage production is stripped away. Stray Kids have appeared in the American late-night circuit, and those appearances have given international audiences, many of whom had never encountered the group before, their first real look at who these 8 people actually are off the choreographed stage. And consistently across different platforms and different formats, Felix tends to be the member that new viewers remember. It's worth asking why. Jimmy Fallon is, by his own design, one of the most enthusiastic hosts in late-night history. His style is built on genuine excitement. He plays games with guests, he laughs easily, he creates moments of unscripted warmth. But because of that style, his show also functions as an unintentional spotlight. When Fallon interacts with a group, the cameras catch reactions, and reactions tell you something that carefully rehearsed performances sometimes can't. Felix's reactions are specific. They're present in a way that reads differently from the other members. This is not a criticism of the rest of Stray Kids, a group that is objectively composed of 8 highly trained, highly capable performers. But there is something about the way Felix exists in unscripted moments that draws attention. He doesn't perform being happy or surprised or amused. When something is funny, you can see it land on his face before he decides what to do with it. When something is unexpected, he doesn't rush to recover. He simply sits inside the moment for a beat longer than most performers would allow themselves to. In television production, that quality has a name. It's called being watchable, and it's far less common than talent. Being watchable is different from being talented. Talent is trainable. You can drill choreography until it becomes instinct. You can run vocal exercises until your range extends. You can study charisma, study stage presence, study camera angles until you know exactly where to stand for maximum effect. All of that is achievable with enough time and effort. But watchability, the quality that makes a viewer's eye drift toward you even when you're not the one speaking, even when you're standing at the edge of a group, even when you're not doing anything particularly remarkable, that is something else entirely. It's what separates a performer from a presence. Felix has it in a way that becomes immediately obvious in a format like Fallon's. When the group is seated together for an interview segment, Felix tends to be the one that viewers who don't know Stray Kids will find themselves trying to identify. There's a softness to his expressions that makes him approachable on camera, not passive, but open. His face communicates clearly without exaggerating. He doesn't reach for the camera reaches for him. Part of this comes down to contrast, and contrast is one of the most powerful tools in visual storytelling. Felix is, by most standards, not what you would expect. His face reads young and almost gentle, carrying a kind of warmth that doesn't immediately suggest intensity. But then you hear him rap. That deep, gravel-edged voice drops into the mix, and the entire frame around him shifts. Suddenly, the gentleness of his face becomes something more layered, more interesting, because it's housing something you didn't anticipate. That gap between what you expect and what you get is exactly the kind of thing that keeps a viewer's attention locked. Late-night audiences are particularly sensitive to this. They're watching from home, often casually, often multitasking. Their attention has to be earned every few seconds. A performer who creates an internal contradiction, one that makes you want to figure them out, holds that attention longer than a performer who confirms every expectation you walked in with. Felix creates that contradiction effortlessly. There's also the matter of his background, which adds another layer to how he reads in an American media context. Felix grew up in Sydney, Australia, which means English is not his second language. It is, in many ways, his first. His natural comfort with the English-speaking world is visible in ways that can be subtle, but are quietly significant. He doesn't brace himself for English interactions the way a performer navigating a second language might. There's no extra cognitive weight sitting on his shoulders when an American host says something unexpected. He processes, responds, and adjusts, naturally, at speed, with humor when appropriate. That ease doesn't go unnoticed by hosts like Fallon, who are trained to sense comfort in their guests. A guest who is genuinely at ease, not performing ease, but actually experiencing it, makes the host's job easier and the segment feel more real. Felix gives that to the format, and in return, the format gives him visibility. The result, repeated across multiple American appearances, is a version of Felix that feels consistent regardless of the setting, whether the camera is catching a planned performance or a spontaneous reaction to something Fallon just said. The person on screen is the same person. That consistency is its own form of character. And character, in a media landscape oversaturated with carefully managed images, is one of the rarest things you can actually have. For audiences encountering Stray Kids for the first time through an American late-night lens, Felix is often the entry point. He's the member they Google. He's the name they come back with after the episode ends. And what they find when they start looking is where things get even more interesting, because the next person on this list wasn't paying attention to Felix's face or his personality. They were listening to something else entirely. Number 5. Charlie Puth. Felix carries a voice that no other member can replicate. Charlie Puth hears things that most people don't. That's not a metaphor. It's a documented, medically recognized condition called perfect pitch or absolute pitch, the rare neurological ability to identify or reproduce any musical note without an external reference point. Puth has spoken openly about this in interviews, explaining that he processes sound differently from most people, that music is essentially a second language his brain speaks fluently and constantly. When he listens to a song, he's not just hearing melody and rhythm, he's hearing the precise architecture underneath it, the intervals, the tonal colors, the micro variations in timbre that most listeners process unconsciously, if at all. That context matters here, because when someone with Charlie Puth's level of auditory sensitivity pays attention to a voice, it means something specific. Puth has shown genuine interest in K-pop as a genre and has interacted with artists from the space in ways that go beyond surface-level celebrity crossover. He has worked with artists from the space, spoken about Korean music in interviews with clear familiarity, and engaged with the sonic landscape of the genre with the ear of someone who is actually listening rather than simply acknowledging. When he encounters a voice that stands out, even within a genre that is specifically engineered to produce exceptional vocal performances, it registers differently for him than it would for the average listener. Felix's voice is the kind of voice that registers. To understand why, it helps to understand what makes it unusual, not just within Stray Kids, but within the broader context of K-pop and even popular music in general. Felix's vocal range sits in the bass baritone register, a range that is uncommon in any genre of contemporary popular music and particularly rare in K-pop, which has historically centered higher tenor voices and lighter timbres as its dominant vocal aesthetic. This is not a stylistic choice on Felix's part. It's simply what his voice is. The depth is natural, the resonance is natural, and the contrast it creates against the sonic palette of everything around it is, as a direct result, also natural. Natural is important. In an industry where vocal production is refined, layered, tuned, and engineered to a degree of precision that rivals classical recording, a voice that sounds genuinely unprocessed, that has texture and weight and grain, even in its raw form, is immediately distinguishable. Felix's voice has that quality. Stripped of production, it still occupies a room. It still carries. It still arrives before the words do. For a musician like Charlie Puth, that kind of voice is not just interesting, it's significant, because what it represents is a tonal color that cannot be manufactured. You can train a vocalist to improve their technique, their breath control, their resonance, but you cannot train someone to have a bass voice if their vocal anatomy doesn't support it. Felix's voice is not something that was built in a practice room. It was already there. What training did was refine it, and that refinement is visible in how Felix uses his voice within Stray Kids' musical architecture. His role as a rapper means that his voice functions in tracks not as a melodic centerpiece, but as a rhythmic and textural element. And because his voice is so tonally distinct from the other members, his sections in any given song are identifiable within the first syllable. You don't need to know who Felix is to know when Felix is rapping. The voice announces itself. This is, from a pure music production standpoint, an asset of considerable value. Consider how producers and musicians approach the concept of sonic identity. When you build a group or a band, one of the central challenges is creating a sound that coheres, that feels like a single unified thing, while also giving each individual component enough distinctiveness to register separately. Stray Kids as a production unit, with Bang Chan, Changbin, and Han forming the in-house producing team known as 3 Racha, has clearly understood this from early in the group's discography. The sonic space they build in their tracks has specific slots, and Felix's voice fills a slot that nothing else in the lineup can fill. That's not simply an observation about range, it's an observation of irreplaceability. Charlie Puth, across his own career, has built a brand on the idea that sonic specificity matters, that a voice, a sound, a particular quality of musical expression is worth protecting and developing precisely because it cannot be replicated. His own falsetto, his particular phrasing style, the way he layers harmonics in production, these are all deliberate choices rooted in the belief that distinctiveness is more valuable than versatility. From that framework, Felix's voice would be immediately legible as something worth paying attention to. There's also a second dimension to Felix's voice that tends to get overlooked in surface-level discussions. Its emotional register. Deep voices carry emotional weight differently from higher voices. There's a physical resonance to bass frequencies that affects how sound is experienced in the body, not just heard, but felt. When Felix's voice drops into a track's heavier sections, particularly in Stray Kids' harder-edged material, the effect is less about note hitting and more about pressure. It adds mass to the music. It grounds the sound in a way that keeps the track from floating too high above the listener. For musicians who understand production, who know that the low end of a mix is what gives it physical presence in a room or through a speaker, this is exactly the kind of contribution that earns respect. Not necessarily applause, respect. The kind that comes from another professional recognizing a specific technical excellence. Felix's voice, within the context of Stray Kids and within the broader landscape of K-pop, is genuinely unusual, and within the context of American music culture, where bass voices carry a long, deep history across genres from soul to hip-hop to country, it translates in a way that feels immediate and familiar, even to listeners who have never heard a K-pop song before. That translation ability from one musical world to another without losing anything is something the next person on this list has spent his entire career chasing across genre lines, and what he saw in Felix was something he recognized from the inside.
Number 4. Steve Aoki. Felix carries a global appeal that doesn't need translation. Steve Aoki has played in over 250 cities across 6 continents. He has performed for crowds that don't share a language, don't share a culture, and don't share a musical tradition, and he has consistently found a way to make all of them move to the same beat. That's not an accident or a stroke of luck. It's the result of 2 decades of learning, in real time and in real rooms, exactly what it is about a performer that crosses every cultural barrier simultaneously. When someone with that kind of experience looks at an artist and says that artist has global appeal, it carries a different weight than when a marketing department says it. Aoki's relationship with K-pop is not new and not casual. He has collaborated with BTS, producing and featuring on Wasted on Me, a track that demonstrated his genuine investment in the genre rather than a calculated positioning move. He has spoken about Korean music with familiarity and respect in multiple interviews. He understands the mechanics of how K-pop operates at an industry level, which means he also understands what makes an individual performer stand out within a system that is specifically designed to produce polished, high-functioning groups rather than solo stars. From that vantage point, Felix is an interesting case study. K-pop as an industry prioritizes the group unit above almost everything else. The training systems, the debut processes, the album concepts, the choreography, all of it is engineered to present a cohesive whole. Individual members develop personas and fandoms within that structure, but the architecture itself is built around the group. This means that when a member manages to develop a clearly distinct individual identity, one that reads globally, not just within the K-pop fandom ecosystem, it's worth examining how that happened. Felix's global readability starts with something that most people intuitively notice but rarely articulate clearly. He doesn't require cultural decoding. What this means practically is that Felix's appeal doesn't depend on the viewer already being inside the K-pop world to understand. His visual presentation, the freckles, the expressive face, the fashion that leans toward bold without becoming theatrical, translates across cultural reference points. His energy in performance reads as intensity and commitment in any language. His personality in candid settings, warm, self-aware, occasionally self-deprecating, maps onto universally legible human qualities that don't need a specific cultural context to be understood. This is rarer than it sounds. Many performers are excellent within the frame of their own cultural context and require significant additional exposure before an outside audience fully grasps what makes them compelling. Felix operates the other way. The first impression already contains enough information to create genuine interest, regardless of whether the viewer has any prior K-pop literacy. Steve Aoki's career has been built on identifying exactly this quality in music and in performers. His DJ sets move seamlessly across genres: EDM, hip-hop, pop, reggaeton. Not because he abandons sonic identity but because his energy and performance style carry enough universal charge to make the genre transitions feel natural rather than jarring. He has an intuitive understanding of what makes something travel versus what makes something stay local. And the performers he gravitates toward, the collaborations he chooses, tend to reflect that same instinct for translatability. Felix's physical presence is one component of this global readability. But it goes deeper than aesthetics. There is also the matter of how Felix performs. Stray Kids' stage presence as a group is widely acknowledged even outside the K-pop fandom space. The group's live performances are consistently cited for their intensity, their precision, and the genuine commitment each member brings to the physical execution of a show. Within that context, Felix occupies a specific role. He is one of the group's primary visual anchors during performance, meaning that choreography frequently positions him in ways that require him to carry significant visual weight without losing the precision the group's performance style demands. Doing that successfully, holding visual authority in a high-velocity group performance, requires a particular combination of physical control, spatial awareness, and what performers call stage presence in its truest sense. Not confidence performed for the camera, but an actual, functional ability to fill the space you're standing in. Felix has this at a level that is immediately visible even to viewers who don't know enough about choreography to articulate what they're seeing. They simply notice that when Felix is moving, they're watching Felix. From an industry perspective, particularly from the perspective of someone like Steve Aoki, who has spent his career building festivals and events and tour schedules around the fundamental question of who can hold a crowd, that quality is one of the most commercially significant things a performer can possess. There's also a cultural dimension specific to Felix that deserves attention. Felix was raised in Australia, which places him at an interesting intersection. He is ethnically Korean, which connects him authentically to the culture from which Stray Kids emerges. He was raised in an English-speaking, Western cultural context, which gives him an intuitive fluency with the reference points that dominate global entertainment. And he trained and debuted in South Korea, which means he has navigated one of the most rigorous performance development systems in the world. That combination, ethnic Korean, Western upbringing, Korean entertainment training, is not common. And it produces a performer who can exist authentically in multiple cultural spaces simultaneously without appearing to switch between them. For a global music ecosystem that is still actively working out how to integrate K-pop into mainstream Western entertainment infrastructure, that kind of performer is genuinely valuable. Not as a bridge or a compromise, but as someone who is simply at home in multiple worlds at once. Steve Aoki, who has spent his entire career living in that same kind of multi-world space, too electronic for rock, too festival for pop, too global to be categorized neatly by any single market, would recognize that quality immediately. And it's a quality that, as the next person on this list noticed, shows up most dramatically not in the music or on the stage, but in something far more visual, far more immediate, and far more telling about who Felix actually is. Number 3. Zendaya. Felix carries a fashion presence that operates on its own terms. There is a specific kind of person who can wear something and make you forget the clothes. Most people wear fashion. A smaller number of people carry it. And then there is an even smaller category, the kind that Zendaya has occupied for the better part of a decade, where the person and the garment become a single conversation, where what they're wearing becomes inseparable from who they are in that moment. Fashion at that level stops being decoration and becomes language. Zendaya didn't arrive at that position through luck or a good stylist alone. She built it through a consistent, decade-long practice of treating fashion as a serious creative discipline, choosing pieces that provoke rather than simply impress, working with designers like La Roche to construct visual narratives that change public conversation, and doing all of it with a physical stillness and confidence that makes every look feel considered rather than costumed. The fashion industry, which is notoriously difficult to impress and even harder to genuinely move, responded by treating her as one of the defining style figures of her generation. When someone operating at that level of fashion intelligence notices another performer's visual presence, it's worth understanding why. Felix's relationship with fashion is not incidental to who he is as a performer. It is, in many ways, one of the most consistent and revealing expressions of his identity available to outside observers. And what makes it particularly interesting, especially from a Western fashion perspective, is that it operates by its own internal logic rather than by the conventions of any single aesthetic tradition. K-pop fashion, broadly speaking, tends toward high-concept, highly coordinated group aesthetics, looks that are designed to function within the visual grammar of music video production and synchronized stage performance. Members typically wear what the creative team assigns within that system. But Felix has a documented history of bringing something personal to whatever he's wearing, a quality that makes his individual looks read differently from the same items as worn by his members. This isn't about having a louder style or a more aggressive approach to fashion. It's something subtler and ultimately more significant. He has a body language relationship with clothing that is his own. To understand what this means in practice, consider how fashion actually works on a body. A garment is a two-dimensional object until someone puts it on. What happens after that depends entirely on how the person wearing it moves, stands, holds their shoulders, distributes their weight, makes eye contact with a camera. This is why identical pieces look completely different on different people, not because of body type, but because of presence. The person's energy, their relationship to physical space, their level of comfort with being looked at, all of these things reshape the garment around them. Felix's physical presence in fashion contexts is specifically notable because of a quality that is genuinely unusual. He carries softness and strength in the same frame, simultaneously, without either quality canceling the other out. His facial features, the freckles, the relatively gentle bone structure, the expressive eyes, create a visual warmth that makes him approachable in photographs and on camera. But his body language in performance contexts, and increasingly in fashion contexts as well, carries a different kind of weight. He is not a small presence. He doesn't recede. He occupies space with a full body stillness that is, paradoxically, one of the most commanding things a person in front of a camera can do. Standing completely still, completely present, without fidgeting or adjusting or reaching for the camera, that is harder than it looks, and Felix does it naturally. The result is that his fashion moments consistently produce images with a quality that photographers and creative directors refer to as tension, not conflict, but the productive visual tension that comes from a subject who contains more than one thing at once. The softness of his face against the weight of his presence. The approachability of his expression against the strength of his physical authority in the frame. That tension is what makes an image interesting beyond the initial glance. Zendaya's best fashion moments operate on exactly this principle. The looks that became cultural events, the Cinderella dress at the Oscars, the Joan of Arc armor look, the various Valentino pieces that stopped conversation, all of them worked because of the same productive contradiction. A person who looks entirely at ease while simultaneously commanding the room. The garment amplifies something that already exists in the person rather than creating an impression from scratch. Felix's fashion trajectory has been moving in that direction with increasing clarity. His personal style outside of group promotional contexts, which Stray Kids fans and fashion observers have tracked through airport appearances, variety show footage, and social media, tends toward pieces that are either structurally unusual, tonally understated, or both simultaneously. He gravitates toward looks that require the wearer to commit fully in order to work. He doesn't hedge stylistically. He makes a choice and carries it without apology, which is the single most important technical skill in fashion at the highest level. There is also the matter of Felix's willingness to experiment across gender-fluid fashion territory, which is an area where Zendaya herself has been a consistent and influential presence. Felix has worn pieces that challenge conventional masculine fashion boundaries in ways that feel deliberate rather than provocative, choosing elegance over edge, choosing aesthetic integrity over safety, in a way that reads as genuine expression rather than a calculated attempt to generate attention. In the current landscape of global fashion, that kind of authenticity has a very specific and highly valued currency. From Zendaya's perspective, as someone who has made fashion into a serious artistic practice rather than a promotional tool, that level of intentionality in a performer of Felix's age and global position would register as something genuinely worth watching. Not because of the brand names involved or the stage budget, but because of the quality of conviction behind the choices. Fashion, at its highest level, is about what a person brings to the cloth. Not the other way around. Felix brings something that not every member of Stray Kids brings in the same way, and not every performer of his generation brings at all. And that quality, which shows up so clearly in a fashion context, becomes even more visible when the setting shifts from a runway or a music video to something far more unscripted, far more exposed, and far more revealing of who a person actually is. Which is exactly where our next person encountered him. Number 2. Ryan Gosling. Felix carries a contradiction that makes people look twice. Ryan Gosling has built one of the most durable careers in modern Hollywood on a single, deceptively simple foundation. He is consistently not what you expect. He looks like a conventional leading man, symmetrical, composed, the kind of face that belongs on a poster. But then he plays Lars, a man who falls in love with a plastic doll and treats it with complete, unironic sincerity. He plays a jazz musician in La La Land who loses the girl and still ends the film with quiet dignity. He plays a character literally named Ken in Barbie and turns it into one of the most genuinely funny and unexpectedly layered performances of his generation. Every time an audience thinks they have Ryan Gosling figured out, he does something that quietly dismantles the assumption. That ability, to contain a contradiction and make it work for you rather than against you, is not common. It requires a specific relationship with your own identity, a comfort with being misread on first impression, and a patience that allows the full picture to emerge on its own schedule. Gosling has this. He doesn't rush to explain himself. He lets the work do it. Felix, in a remarkably different context and at a significantly different career stage, operates by a strikingly similar internal logic. The most immediate version of Felix's contradiction is the one that almost everyone encounters first, his voice. The disconnect between his face and his voice is dramatic enough that it has become one of the most frequently cited aspects of his identity among people encountering Stray Kids for the first time. His features read as soft, the freckles, the open expression, the warmth that his face carries at rest. Then he speaks, or more precisely, then he raps. And what comes out is a bass-toned voice with genuine depth and physical weight that belongs, by sonic convention, to someone who looks nothing like Felix. The reaction this produces is almost always the same, a pause. A recalibration. A second look, not because something went wrong, but because something was more interesting than anticipated. That moment of recalibration is, in creative terms, one of the most valuable things a performer can produce in an audience. It creates active engagement. It transforms a passive viewer into someone who is now paying attention, now curious, now invested in figuring out what else doesn't match what they assumed. The contradiction doesn't create confusion, it creates interest. And interest, sustained and developed, is what eventually becomes genuine connection between a performer and an audience. Ryan Gosling has weaponized this dynamic across a decades-long career. Felix, whether entirely by design or by the honest expression of who he actually is producing the same dynamic at a global scale. But the contradiction in Felix goes beyond the voice-face mismatch, which is ultimately a surface-level observation. There are deeper contradictions that become visible the more time you spend watching how he actually operates in different environments. Consider his emotional register. Felix is, by consistent account from members, staff, and fans who have observed him across many years and many contexts, a warm and gentle person. He is physically affectionate with his members, which in Korean group dynamics is entirely normalized, but Felix's version of it is notable even within that context for its apparent sincerity. He is known to be considerate, to check in on people, to bring a softness to interpersonal dynamics within the group that members have referenced explicitly in interviews. Chan, as the group's leader, has spoken about Felix with a specific kind of protective tenderness that you don't perform, that you produce when you genuinely care about someone's well-being. And yet, on stage, Felix is one of the most intense presences in a group that is already defined by intensity. Stray Kids' performance aesthetic is not gentle. Their choreography is physically demanding, their energy is high velocity, their stage presence is built around controlled aggression and commitment to the full physical execution of whatever the track demands. Within that environment, Felix performs with a focus and a physical authority that is entirely inconsistent with the softness that characterizes him off stage. This is the deeper contradiction, and it's the more interesting one. Most people are largely continuous between their on-stage and off-stage selves. The performance amplifies or formalizes what is already there, but the basic character remains readable across both contexts. Felix, by contrast, seems to have two modes that are both entirely genuine and almost entirely distinct from each other. The off-stage Felix and the on-stage Felix are not performing versions of each other. They are the same person operating in completely different registers, and the gap between those registers is wide enough to feel like a reveal every single time. Ryan Gosling does something similar on screen. His characters in films like Drive, almost entirely silent, contained to the point of apparent emptiness, violent when violence arrives with startling suddenness, share almost no surface qualities with his press tour persona, which is self-deprecating, quick, and genuinely funny. Both are authentic. Both are him. The range between them is what makes him interesting as an actor rather than simply as a face. For Felix, that range, between the person who brings gentle warmth to his members in a backstage moment and the performer who commands a stadium stage with physical authority, is what makes him interesting as a performer rather than simply as a visual. There is one more dimension to Felix's contradiction that deserves specific attention, and it relates to something that the entertainment industry, both Korean and American, consistently struggles to produce: authenticity under pressure. Felix has spoken publicly about personal difficulties, about homesickness, about the weight of being far from his family in Australia, about the psychological demands of the training system and the debut process. These are not fabricated vulnerabilities performed for sympathy. They are documented, specific, and consistent across different interviews and different formats over several years. And what is notable about how Felix carries these difficulties is that they don't harden him. He doesn't perform toughness to compensate. He doesn't pretend the weight isn't there. He simply carries it alongside everything else, the warmth, the performance, the contradiction, and lets it be part of the complete picture. In a media landscape where performers are almost universally managed toward a particular image, where vulnerability is often either hidden entirely or strategically deployed for publicity purposes, Felix's version of openness feels genuinely unmanaged. It arrives when it arrives. It doesn't follow a narrative plan. Ryan Gosling, who has consistently refused to make his personal life a performance and who has built his public image around doing the work rather than managing the perception, would recognize that quality immediately. Because what Felix has, what makes him hard to look away from even when he's standing in a group of 8 exceptionally talented performers, is the quality that Gosling himself has built an entire career on. He is exactly who he appears to be. And then, a moment later, he's more than that. That combination, authenticity layered with depth, contradiction made comfortable rather than confusing, is what brings us to the final name on this list. Someone who has stood in front of more cameras, more crowds, and more high-pressure moments than almost anyone alive. And who, when he finally stood in the same room as Felix, saw something in him that even this list hasn't fully articulated yet. Number 1. Hugh Jackman. Felix stands out even when standing next to Hollywood legends. There is a particular kind of test that no training system can fully prepare you for. It's not a performance test. It's not a technical assessment. It's something simpler and far more revealing. What happens to a person when they are placed, with very little warning and very little buffer, directly in the physical presence of someone whose name has been known to the entire world for over 2 decades? How do they hold themselves? How much of who they actually are survives that pressure intact? Hugh Jackman, 25 years of Wolverine, multiple Tony Awards, one of the most physically commanding presences in Hollywood history, and by virtually every account from every co-star and collaborator who has ever worked with him, one of the most genuinely warm and disarming human beings in the entertainment industry, is exactly that kind of test. Not because he is intimidating in the aggressive sense, but because his combination of global recognition, physical presence, and effortless charisma creates a gravitational field. People around him tend to adjust themselves without realizing it. They become slightly louder, or slightly quieter, or slightly more performed, reaching, in some direction, for a version of themselves that feels adequate to the proximity. In the summer of 2024, during the promotional run for Deadpool and Wolverine, Felix and Bang Chan appeared alongside Hugh Jackman and Ryan Reynolds. This was not a brief, managed photo opportunity. It was an extended interaction, captured on camera, in which both sides of this equation, the Hollywood legends and the K-pop performers, were visible to each other and to the audience simultaneously. What happened is worth examining carefully, because it tells you something specific about Felix that nothing else on this list quite captures. The initial moments of the interaction showed exactly what you'd expect. Felix was visibly aware of the magnitude of what he was standing in the middle of. He didn't pretend otherwise. There was a genuine quiet in him at the start, not the rehearsed composure of a trained performer suppressing nerves, but the honest stillness of a person who is fully present in an overwhelming moment and is choosing to experience it rather than manage it. That choice, to be actually there rather than to perform being there, is the first thing about Felix in that interaction that stands out. Most performers at Felix's career stage, placed suddenly in physical proximity to 2 of Hollywood's most recognizable names in the middle of a live promotional format, would do one of 2 things. They would either contract, become smaller, quieter, more deferential, disappearing into the background because the foreground feels too exposed, or they would overextend, reaching for a projected confidence that doesn't quite fit, trying to match the energy of the room at a volume they haven't earned yet. Felix did neither. What he did instead was something that, when you watch the footage, reads as almost paradoxically simple. He was himself. He moved through the discomfort of the opening moments without forcing it to resolve faster than it naturally would. He responded to Jackman and Reynolds with genuine reactions rather than performed ones. When something was funny, it was funny to him in real time, not 3 seconds later when the appropriate response had been calculated. When there was a moment that called for restraint, he was restrained, not because he had prepared that particular response, but because restraint is actually part of who he is. And then, gradually, without announcement, he found his footing. The transition wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where Felix came alive or took over the room in the way that a highlight reel would package it. It was quieter and more interesting than that. It was simply that at some point in the interaction, Felix was no longer visibly adjusting to the environment. He was simply in it. Present and specific and exactly himself, in front of 2 of the most famous people on Earth, without either shrinking from that fact or reaching past it. Hugh Jackman noticed. This is not speculation or fan inference. Jackman's interaction style shifted in a way that is visible on camera. The specific quality of attention he directed toward Felix moved from the warm but general courtesy that a practiced host offers to any new person in the room, to something more targeted. More interested. The kind of attention that someone gives when they have recognized something in a person that they weren't necessarily expecting to find. For Jackman, whose career has required him to be genuinely present with an enormous range of collaborators, from first-time actors to the most veteran performers in the industry, across theater, film, television, and live events. Reading a person quickly and accurately is not a skill, it's a survival mechanism. 25 years in Wolverine means 25 years of knowing, often within minutes of meeting someone, what kind of performer you are actually dealing with beneath the surface presentation. What they're made of when the structure around them falls away. What Felix demonstrated in that interaction was something that Jackman, with that level of calibrated perception, would have clocked immediately, the ability to remain coherent under genuine pressure. Not the managed coherence of preparation, but the organic coherence of someone whose identity is stable enough to survive contact with the unexpected without fragmenting. This is, at its core, what separates performers who have longevity from performers who have a moment. The industry is full of exceptionally talented people who function beautifully within the structure that has been built around them, who perform brilliantly within a rehearsed context, who shine in the specific conditions they've been prepared for, but who become difficult to read or difficult to connect with when those conditions shift. Felix, in the Deadpool and Wolverine interaction, demonstrated that he is not that kind of performer. Remove the stage. Remove the choreography. Remove the members around him and the production team behind him and the specific cultural context that K-pop provides as scaffolding. What remains is a person who is still fully there, still legible, still himself. That is the rarest thing. And it is what Hugh Jackman, who has spent a quarter-century building exactly that quality in his own craft, would recognize as the foundation of something that actually lasts. There's a detail from the interaction that is easy to overlook but worth noting. At one point, Felix's instinct was to step back slightly, to give space, to be considerate of the dynamic, to not impose himself on a moment that wasn't specifically his. And Jackman's response, without drawing explicit attention to it, was to bring him back in. To make the space specifically include Felix. That exchange, brief, unscripted, and visible on camera for only a few seconds, is actually the most telling moment of the entire interaction. Because what it showed was mutual recognition, Felix recognizing that he was in a room with people whose experience far exceeded his own, and Jackman recognizing that the person stepping back wasn't doing so out of inadequacy, but out of a genuinely grounded sense of proportion. Jackman's career, the theater work, the Wolverine years, the live performances, the fundraising work, the reputation that has survived every industry shift of the past 25 years, was built on that same grounded proportion. On knowing exactly who you are and being entirely comfortable with that knowledge, even in the most overwhelming rooms. Felix, at a fraction of Jackman's age and career stage, in a second language, in a cultural context not entirely his own, in front of two of the most recognizable humans on the planet, demonstrated that same quality. Not perfectly. Not without the visible weight of the moment. But authentically. Completely. Without flinching from what the moment actually was. And perhaps that is the most accurate answer to the question this list has been building toward. What makes Felix different from the other members of Stray Kids is not one thing, not the voice, not the visual, not the fashion, not the cultural fluency, not the contradiction. It is the combination of all of those things, held together by a center that doesn't move when the pressure arrives. In a room full of legends, that center is exactly what Hugh Jackman was looking at.